Hello everyone. Welcome to the podcast, where we explore in a whole new way. Let's step into the fascinating world of podcasts, where each video brings knowledge and unforgettable experiences. The story I want to share is this: I never imagined my life could be torn apart by the two people I trusted the most. The wife I loved and the best friend I always trusted, both of them secretly destroyed everything. But the worst part? My father was involved too. They pushed me to the edge, and when the truth was revealed, I had no choice but to seek revenge. Don't think this is just a story about betrayal, because the way I respond will make everything more terrifying than anything you've ever imagined. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new information. Now, let's get started. Marshall's plane touched down just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the suburbs of his hometown in a soft, amber glow. It had been a long, grueling week away at a sustainable building conference in Singapore. As an architect with a passion for eco-friendly design, Marshall had felt rejuvenated by the innovations and ideas he had absorbed during the event. Yet, as he drove through the familiar streets of his suburban neighborhood, a sense of unease crept over him. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Pulling into his driveway, that sense of unease solidified into something more concrete: Roger's red sports car. It sat parked casually in front of Marshall's modest home, gleaming in the fading light. Marshall's pulse quickened as he stared at the car. Roger was a colleague, a supposed friend, but there was no reason for him to be at the house. Not now. Not when Marshall had just returned from being halfway across the world. Slowly, Marshall climbed out of his car, his gaze never leaving the sports car. A knot of dread twisted in his gut as he approached the house. He had a terrible feeling, one he couldn't shake, and it became all-consuming as he reached the window. Peering inside, Marshall froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the living room window, he saw them, Ruby, his wife, and Roger, sitting far too close on the couch. The intimate way they leaned into one another, the way Ruby's hand rested lightly on Roger's knee, sent a wave of nausea crashing over Marshall. His hands clenched into fists, his vision narrowing on the scene inside. He couldn't believe it. His mind scrambled for an explanation, anything that would make sense, but there was nothing. Just the raw reality of the situation. Marshall took a step back from the window, his heart racing. It felt like time had stopped, the world spinning off its axis as he tried to process the betrayal unfolding before him. He wanted to storm in, to demand answers, but his legs felt leaden. He stood there, paralyzed, as if watching his life unravel from a distance. Just then, his father, Frederick, stepped out from the shadows, his face wearing a smug expression that only deepened Marshall's growing horror. "You're back early," Frederick said with a sneer, his voice thick with derision. "You weren't supposed to see this." Marshall's eyes snapped to his father, confusion flashing across his face. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Frederick let out a short, mocking laugh. "Roger's been paying me to keep quiet about this arrangement." The revelation hit Marshall like a sledgehammer. His own father had been complicit in this betrayal, selling out his son for money. His father's eyes glinted with a twisted satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Marshall's legs finally responded, propelling him toward the front door. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. He barely registered the look of shock on Ruby and Roger's faces when he threw open the door. They sprang apart, guilt written all over their features. But Marshall didn't speak. He couldn't. His voice had been stolen by the magnitude of what he'd just uncovered. Without a word, he turned on his heel and marched into his home office. Ruby followed, her voice rising in panic as she pleaded for him to talk, to give her a chance to explain. But Marshall wasn't listening. He reached for the stack of financial documents he kept tucked away, documents that detailed the empire they had built together. He had trusted her with everything. As Ruby tried to reach out to him, Marshall looked at her with cold, detached eyes. She wasn't the woman he had married anymore. She was a stranger. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice hard and final. Without another glance, he walked out of the house, leaving behind a stunned Ruby, a smug Roger, and a corrupt father in the wake of his shattered life. Marshall slammed the door behind him, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts and emotions battling for dominance as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. The betrayal was too much to comprehend. Ruby, the woman he had trusted with his heart, and Roger, the man he had considered a friend, how long had this been going on? His hands shook as he rifled through the financial documents in his office. These were the contracts, the bank statements, the plans for their shared future. It was all a lie. Every bit of it. Ruby had betrayed him not just personally, but financially. The life they had built together, the investments, the trust, none of it mattered now. A soft knock on the door interrupted his frantic search. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew who it was. Ruby stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with guilt and fear. She took a hesitant step forward. "Marshall, please, just listen. Let me explain." Marshall slowly turned to face her, his expression cold and unreadable. He could barely bring himself to look at her. Every time he did, all he saw was the image of her sitting too close to Roger, her hand on his knee, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. The memory made his stomach churn. "There's nothing to explain," he said, his voice low but steady. "I saw everything." Ruby took another step forward, desperation seeping into her voice. "Marshall, I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything. Please, we can fix this. Don't leave." Marshall's eyes hardened, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he spoke with real emotion. "A mistake," he repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call it? A mistake? How long has this been going on, Ruby? How long have you been lying to me?" Ruby swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "It was just a few months. But I swear, it didn't mean anything. I love you, Marshall. I do. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button." Marshall laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a cold, empty sound. "Love? You call this love? You've been sleeping with my so-called friend, and you think that's something we can fix?" Roger appeared in the hallway, hovering just outside the door, his face a mask of discomfort. He looked at Marshall, then at Ruby, before speaking. "Marshall, man, let's talk about this. It's not what it looks like." Marshall's eyes snapped to Roger, a wave of fury rising in him. "Not what it looks like," he spat. "I saw you. I saw the way you were with her. And now you're standing here, in my house, telling me that it's not what it looks like." Roger shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Ruby, desperate now, moved closer to Marshall, reaching out for him. "Please, Marshall. Don't do this. Don't leave with those documents. We built this together." Marshall stepped back, avoiding her touch. "We didn't build anything together," he said coldly. "I built this. I trusted you, and you threw it all away." With that, Marshall turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ruby and Roger standing in stunned silence. As he reached the door, he glanced back one last time, his voice cold and final. "It's over." And then, without another word, he was gone. Marshall checked into a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where anonymity was a given and no one asked questions. The small, musty room was a far cry from the comfort of his own home, but right now, comfort was the last thing on his mind. He needed space to think, to process, and more importantly, to plan. As he sat on the worn bed, his thoughts spiraled through the events of the last few hours. The documents he had taken from his office were spread out across the bed, a detailed record of everything he and Ruby had built over the years. But now, as Marshall went through them, something new began to surface, small discrepancies that he hadn't noticed before. Transactions that didn't add up, missing funds, projects that had suddenly fallen through. Ruby's betrayal wasn't just personal, it went deeper. She and Roger had been siphoning off money for months, maybe even years. His heart hardened as the realization hit him. They had been planning this for a long time. Everything they had shared, the house, the business, the future, it had all been built on lies. But now that he knew the truth, Marshall was determined to destroy what they had built. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next morning, Marshall made a call to the one person he knew he could trust, his mother, Lorraine. Lorraine had been a forensic accountant before she retired, and she had always been wary of Ruby. "There's something off about that girl," she had said more than once, but Marshall had dismissed it, blinded by love. Now, he wished he had listened. Lorraine answered on the first ring. "Marshall, what's going on? You sound awful." "I need your help, Mom," Marshall said, his voice tight. "It's Ruby. She's been stealing from me. From us." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Lorraine responded, her voice sharp and focused. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Marshall laid it all out, what he had seen, what he had found, and how deep he suspected the betrayal went. Lorraine listened carefully, asking pointed questions, and by the end of the call, she had a plan. "I'll look into it," she said. "But you're going to need more than just financial records if you want to take them down. Do you have any proof of what they've been doing?" "Not yet," Marshall admitted. "But I'm working on it." "I know someone who can help," Lorraine said. "His name is Na. He's a cybersecurity expert. If there's anything in Roger's emails or Ruby's accounts, he'll find it." Within hours, Marshall was sitting across from Na, a brilliant but unassuming young man who had come highly recommended by Lorraine. Na wasted no time getting to work, diving into Roger's emails and digital records. What he found confirmed everything Marshall had suspected. Not only had Roger and Ruby been stealing money, but they had also been using Marshall's designs and project bids to further their own careers. As Marshall looked over the evidence Na had gathered, a new sense of purpose settled over him. He wasn't going to just confront them. He was going to destroy them, professionally, financially, and personally. It was time for his revenge to begin. The town hall was packed with people that evening, the air thick with anticipation. Marshall sat near the front, his eyes scanning the room, waiting for the perfect moment. The evidence he had gathered with Lorraine and Na sat in a folder on his lap, ready to bring down Roger, Ruby, and Frederick. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen, but there was no turning back now. As the town meeting got underway, local officials discussed the usual mundane issues: road repairs, zoning laws, budget updates. Marshall sat silently, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for his moment to strike. His mother, Lorraine, sat beside him, her calm presence a steadying force. They had worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in order, and now it was time to expose the truth. When the floor opened for public comment, Marshall stood, his hand clutching the folder tightly. He walked to the podium, the eyes of the town fixed on him. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. "I have something important to share," he began, his gaze sweeping the room. "Something that affects all of us." He opened the folder and began laying out the evidence. First, he presented Roger's theft of his designs and project bids, explaining how Roger had passed off Marshall's work as his own to secure contracts and grow his reputation. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Marshall projected the documents on a screen, showing the undeniable proof of Roger's deception. Next, Marshall turned his attention to Frederick, his own father. He exposed the bribes Frederick had taken to push through unsafe building permits, endangering the community for personal gain. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their shock turning to anger as Marshall revealed the depths of Frederick's corruption. Frederick sat in the back, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. Finally, Marshall presented the evidence of Ruby's embezzlement from local charity funds, the betrayal that had cut him the deepest. Ruby had been siphoning money meant for community projects, pocketing it for herself with the help of Roger and Frederick. The crowd erupted in outrage as Marshall showed the financial records, leaving no room for doubt. As Marshall finished his presentation, a stunned silence fell over the room. Then, like a tidal wave, the crowd's anger surged. Shouts of betrayal and disgust echoed through the town hall. People turned on Roger, Frederick, and Ruby, their faces twisted in shock and fury. The trio sat frozen in their seats, their carefully crafted facades crumbling under the weight of their exposed lies. Bridget Chin, a local reporter, stood in the back, her camera live streaming the entire event. As Marshall stepped away from the podium, she caught his eye, nodding slightly. The story was already spreading beyond the walls of the town hall, reaching far more people than anyone in the room could have imagined. Marshall returned to his seat beside Lorraine, his heart still racing but with a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He had done it. He had exposed them all. The damage to their reputations would be irreparable, and soon, the legal consequences would follow. But for now, Marshall allowed himself a small moment of victory, knowing that this was only the beginning. As the meeting continued in chaos, Roger, Ruby, and Frederick remained silent, their faces etched with defeat. There was no escaping the truth now, and the world they had built on lies and betrayal was crashing down around them. In the weeks following the explosive town hall meeting, Marshall set his sights on Roger. Taking him down professionally was the next step in his carefully laid plan. Marshall knew that public exposure was just the beginning. He wanted Roger's entire career to crumble, just as his personal life had. Marshall's first move was reaching out to Carlos Mendo, a powerful figure in the architectural world. Carlos had been a mentor to Marshall early in his career, and they had maintained a cordial relationship ever since. Carlos had influence, not just locally but on a global scale, and Marshall knew he could rely on him to help undermine Roger's standing in the industry. Carlos, intrigued by the details Marshall provided about Roger's theft and deception, agreed to assist. Together, they began to leak incriminating documents to key figures in the industry. Anonymous tips were sent to Roger's top clients, subtly hinting at his shady dealings. They planted seeds of doubt that quickly took root. Soon, whispers began to spread about Roger's integrity, or rather, his lack of it. His once glowing reputation as an up-and-coming architect began to sour. One by one, his clients started pulling out of contracts, unwilling to be associated with someone caught in such a public scandal. Projects were halted, deals fell through, and Roger's professional empire, built on lies and stolen work, started to collapse. Marshall watched with grim satisfaction as Roger's downfall accelerated. But he wasn't done yet. Nah, the cybersecurity expert who had helped uncover Roger's emails, continued to dig deeper into his digital history. What he found only added fuel to the fire. There were emails detailing more than just the theft of Marshall's designs. Roger had been engaging in dubious business practices for years, cutting corners and bribing officials to win contracts. Marshall ensured that these emails found their way to the right people, particularly to Roger's competitors and former clients. He leaked the information strategically, making sure that each revelation struck like a blow, further tarnishing Roger's reputation. By the time the scandal fully erupted, Roger was a pariah in the architectural world. His clients had abandoned him, and his colleagues distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the growing pile of accusations. Even the projects he had managed to hold on to began to unravel as subcontractors refused to work with him, citing concerns over his ethics and legal troubles. Marshall wasn't satisfied with just professional ruin, though. He wanted Roger to feel the personal sting of betrayal that he had felt. Na uncovered more incriminating details, this time, about Roger's connections to Frederick and Ruby. It turned out that Roger had been funneling money not just from Marshall's projects, but from others, into secret accounts that he shared with Frederick and Ruby. Marshall took these findings and, in a calculated move, sent them directly to Roger's most influential client, a client that Roger had fought hard to keep after the initial fallout from the town hall. With this new information, the client immediately cut ties, ensuring that Roger had no path to professional recovery. In the end, Roger was left with nothing. His business was in shambles, his reputation irreparably damaged, and his personal life in ruins. Marshall had destroyed him from every angle, leaving Roger a shell of the man he once was. It was a fitting punishment for the betrayal Roger had orchestrated, and as Marshall watched it all unfold, he felt a cold sense of justice. Roger had taken from him, and now, he had nothing left. Marshall's revenge was complete. With Roger's professional life in ruins, Marshall turned his attention to Frederick and Ruby. Their downfall would be just as thorough, and he knew exactly how to make it happen. Frederick had been involved in dirty dealings for years, and Marshall had all the evidence he needed to bring it to light. Through Lorraine's careful investigations, they had uncovered a trail of bribes Frederick had taken during his tenure in local government, pushing through unsafe building permits for Roger and other unscrupulous developers. Marshall knew this corruption would be the key to Frederick's undoing. Marshall contacted a young, ambitious FBI agent who had been investigating local government corruption for some time. The agent had been eager to get his hands on hard evidence, and Marshall provided him with everything he needed. Detailed records, payments made to Frederick under the table, emails, and correspondence, everything that would prove Frederick's involvement in shady dealings. With this, the FBI had more than enough to launch a formal investigation. News of the investigation quickly spread, and Frederick's political career began to crumble. The local media caught wind of the story, and Frederick was painted as the face of corruption in the town. Public outcry followed, and soon enough, Frederick was forced to resign from his position in disgrace. He faced the looming threat of legal action and possible jail time as the investigation uncovered more of his unethical practices. But that wasn't enough for Marshall. He wanted Ruby to feel the weight of her betrayal as well, and financial ruin was the perfect avenue for that. He had already uncovered evidence of Ruby's embezzlement from local charity funds, but now he needed to cut her off from the life she had grown accustomed to. The financial accounts they had shared were frozen, with Marshall working closely with his bank's fraud department to ensure Ruby couldn't access any of the money she had siphoned away. Ruby, used to a life of luxury, suddenly found herself without the means to support her extravagant lifestyle. Marshall made sure of that. The day Ruby tried to check into a luxury hotel only to be denied service was a small but satisfying victory for him. She had no access to her accounts, and her financial lifeline had been severed. The final blow came when Marshall officially filed for divorce. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, ensuring that Ruby would be left with nothing. The prenup they had signed years ago, before Marshall's career took off, worked entirely in his favor. Ruby had no claim to the assets they had built, and her involvement in the embezzlement case only solidified her fate. Marshall's lawyers ensured that the divorce would proceed swiftly and without contest, leaving Ruby with nothing but her tarnished reputation and a mounting list of legal troubles. As Marshall watched Frederick's political career implode and Ruby's luxurious life fall apart, he felt no sympathy for either of them. They had betrayed him, taken from him, and now they were paying the price. Their downfall was inevitable, and Marshall had made sure that every step was carefully orchestrated to ensure they had no chance of recovering. Frederick and Ruby, once so confident in their schemes, were left with nothing but the wreckage of their deceit. Marshall, having taken everything from them, could now begin to rebuild his life without the shadows of their betrayal looming over him. Late one night, a knock echoed through the quiet halls of Marshall's apartment. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. Ruby, Roger, and Frederick stood huddled together on the other side, their faces gaunt, their eyes pleading. They had come to beg. Marshall's face remained expressionless as he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The room was stark, with only a few pieces of furniture, a reflection of the emptiness that had consumed his life over the past few months. Ruby was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Marshall, please, we've lost everything. You've made your point." Roger stepped forward, trying to project some semblance of authority, though his usual bravado was nowhere to be seen. "This has gone too far. We can fix this, work something out." Frederick, for the first time, looked broken, his usual arrogance replaced with desperation. "You don't have to do this, son. We're family." Marshall remained silent for a long moment, studying their faces. He had once cared about these people. He had once trusted them. Now, all he saw were the remnants of betrayal, the hollow shells of the people who had torn his life apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and detached. "You think this is about making a point?" Ruby took a step closer, tears streaming down her face. "We made mistakes, Marshall, but you can't just destroy us like this. Please, forgive us." A bitter laugh escaped Marshall's lips. "Forgive you? After everything you've done?" He moved to a small table in the corner of the room and picked up a small device. Without another word, he pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of their voices, Roger, Frederick, and Ruby, recorded in secret conversations over the past months. Their admissions of guilt, their scheming, their callous disregard for him. The color drained from Roger's face as he listened, his fists clenching. "You recorded us?" Marshall's gaze was icy. "I made sure there would be no escaping the truth. You betrayed me, all of you. And now, you want to stand here and beg for forgiveness?" Frederick's voice shook as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Marshall, listen." But Marshall cut him off sharply. "No, you listen. I've given you more chances than you ever deserved. I trusted you, Frederick. I built a life with you, Ruby. And you, Roger, you were supposed to be my friend. You all took everything from me." Roger's frustration boiled over, and in a fit of rage, he lunged at Marshall, his hand swinging wildly. But Marshall had anticipated it. With a quick step to the side, he easily dodged Roger's attack, sending him stumbling into the wall. Roger turned, breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. Marshall didn't flinch. His voice remained calm, though the underlying threat was clear. "You're done, all of you. Your lives, your reputations, they're ruined. There's no coming back from this." Ruby sobbed quietly, her head in her hands, while Frederick stood in stunned silence, his pride shattered. Roger, still seething, tried to regain his composure but failed miserably. The truth of their downfall was undeniable, and they all knew it. Marshall moved toward the door, opening it wide. "Get out," he said flatly. "And don't ever come back." One by one, they filed out, their heads hanging low, the weight of their choices finally crashing down on them. As the door closed behind them, Marshall stood alone in the quiet, the last echoes of their betrayal fading away. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. In the stillness, Marshall allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had taken his revenge, but as he stared at the empty room, he realized that the real victory wasn't in their destruction. It was in moving forward, leaving their toxic presence behind, and building a new life from the ashes of what they had tried to destroy. In the days following the final confrontation, Marshall felt a strange calm settle over him. The chaos and turmoil that had consumed his life for months had finally reached its end. Ruby, Roger, and Frederick were gone, and with them went the toxic weight of their betrayal. Marshall found himself standing at the edge of a new beginning, but for the first time in a long while, he felt uncertain about what came next. He returned to his work with a renewed focus. Architecture had always been his passion, a place where he could lose himself in the lines and structures that shaped his designs. But now, it wasn't just a refuge, it was a way to rebuild. He spent hours in his office, working on projects that inspired him, pushing the limits of sustainable design, and seeking out new challenges. His work became the foundation of his recovery, giving him purpose and direction. One morning, Marshall received a call that would change everything. It was Yuki Tanaka, a prominent figure in the architectural world, known for her pioneering work in eco-friendly development. She had been following Marshall's career for years and had heard about the recent upheaval in his personal life. But that wasn't why she was calling. Yuki offered him a prestigious position leading an ambitious, eco-friendly development project in Osaka, Japan, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would put his skills to the test on a global stage. The offer felt like a lifeline. It was exactly what Marshall needed, a fresh start, far away from the memories that haunted him. Without hesitation, he accepted. In the weeks leading up to his departure, Marshall tied up the loose ends of his old life. The divorce from Ruby was finalized, leaving her with nothing, and the legal ramifications of her embezzlement continued to unfold. Frederick's political career was over, and Roger had disappeared from the architectural world, his reputation in tatters. Marshall, however, was ready to move on. Before leaving for Japan, Marshall returned to his childhood home one last time. The house had been empty for years, its walls holding memories both good and bad. He stood in the doorway, taking in the silence, reflecting on how far he had come. The man who had once lived there, the man who had trusted too easily, who had built a life on illusions, was gone. As he wandered through the quiet rooms, Ruby appeared at the front door, her face drawn and hollow. She had come to plead one last time for forgiveness, for a second chance. Her voice cracked as she begged Marshall to reconsider, to remember the good times they had shared. But Marshall, now free of the anger and bitterness that had once consumed him, felt only a quiet resolve. "Our time is over, Ruby," he said softly but firmly. "There's nothing left for us." Ruby's shoulders sagged, and with one last defeated glance, she turned and left. Marshall watched her go, feeling the final chapter of their story close. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He was simply done. The next day, Marshall boarded a plane to Japan, leaving behind everything he had known. As the plane ascended into the sky, he felt lighter than he had in months. His mind was clear, his future wide open. In Osaka, he found himself surrounded by new opportunities, new challenges, and new people. The project was massive, a dream come true for any architect, and Marshall threw himself into the work with a passion he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer defined by his past, no longer burdened by betrayal. He was free to build something new, something stronger, better, and entirely his own. And as the days turned into weeks, Marshall realized that the greatest revenge wasn't in destroying those who had hurt him. It was in rising above them, in reclaiming his life, and in creating a future that was no longer shaped by their actions. The past was behind him, and the future was his to design. Marshall stood on the balcony of his new apartment in Osaka, watching the city lights flicker below. The air was cool, and a sense of peace washed over him that he hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. He thought back on everything that had happened, the betrayal, the confrontations, and the revenge he had sought. But now, as he gazed out at the city, he realized that revenge had never been the point. It wasn't what had given him peace. The road he had traveled was difficult, filled with moments of anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. But through it all, he had learned something invaluable, that his strength didn't come from tearing others down, but from building himself back up. His career, once intertwined with the personal relationships that had betrayed him, was now his own. He had risen out of the wreckage of his past and constructed a new life, one that wasn't bound by the deceit of others. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Yuki, reminding him about a meeting with the development team the next morning. Marshall smiled. His work was challenging and rewarding, everything he had ever wanted as an architect. The project in Osaka had become a passion for him, not just because it was groundbreaking, but because it represented his own fresh start. Marshall thought back to the moment he had left Ruby for good, the final time he had seen her at his childhood home. In that moment, he had finally let go of everything, the betrayal, the hurt, the anger. Ruby had pleaded with him, but Marshall knew their relationship was over. He had walked away not out of spite, but because it was what he needed to do to reclaim his life. Now, Ruby, Roger, and Frederick were all part of a distant past. Their downfall, while necessary for justice, no longer consumed his thoughts. Marshall had come to terms with the fact that their actions said more about them than they ever did about him. He had outgrown the need for revenge and realized that the greatest victory was his own survival and growth. The city below was alive, filled with possibilities. Marshall felt the weight of his past lifting as he embraced the future. He had new friends now, a new team of colleagues who respected him for his talent and drive. He had carved out a space for himself in a world that once seemed broken, and in doing so, he had healed in ways he hadn't thought possible. Marshall walked back inside, his mind clear and focused. The apartment, filled with light and modern furnishings, was a reflection of the new life he had built for himself. It was a far cry from the suffocating atmosphere of the home he had once shared with Ruby, where lies had festered behind closed doors. This space was his own, untouched by the deceit and betrayal that had once consumed his life. As he prepared for the next day's meeting, Marshall took a deep breath. He was no longer defined by the actions of others, no longer weighed down by the pain of the past. He had risen above it, stronger and more resilient than ever before. In the end, Marshall realized that the true revenge wasn't in bringing down those who had hurt him, it was in rising above them, in proving to himself that he could rebuild and create something better. His life was no longer dictated by the betrayal of Ruby, Roger, or Frederick. He had taken control of his own story, and for the first time in a long while, he was the one writing the next chapter. As he lay down to rest that night, Marshall felt a sense of peace. The future stretched out before him, filled with new challenges, new opportunities, and a new sense of purpose. He had moved forward, and that was all that mattered. The past was behind him, and the rest of his life lay ahead, waiting to be built. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button.